June 16, 1944. The English Channel. Flight Lieutenant Joseph Barry throttled his Hawker Tempest forward, engine screaming as he closed the distance on the mechanical demon ahead. The V-1 flying bomb, Hitler's latest terror weapon, cut through the morning sky at 400 miles per hour, its pulse jet engine creating a distinctive, bone-chilling drone that Londoners had already learned to dread. Barry's hands were steady on the controls, but his heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't lining up a gun run. He was preparing to do something no pilot training had ever covered, something that defied every instinct of self-preservation. He was going to fly his wingtip within inches of a 1-ton warhead, traveling faster than most fighter aircraft could manage, and use nothing but air pressure to knock it out of the sky. One miscalculation, one moment of turbulence, and both he and the bomb would disintegrate in a fireball visible for miles. This was the reality facing Britain's fighter pilots in the summer of 1944, when conventional warfare met unconventional desperation, and young men invented impossible solutions to save the lives of strangers below. The V-1 flying bomb represented a terrifying new chapter in warfare. Officially designated the Fieseler Fi-103, the British called it the Doodlebug, the Buzz Bomb, or simply the Flying Bomb. Hitler called it Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1. Launched from sites in occupied France and the Low Countries, these pilotless aircraft were crude by modern standards but devastatingly effective. 25 feet long, carrying an 1,800-pound warhead, powered by a pulse jet that produced that unforgettable stuttering roar. They were cheap to manufacture, required no pilot to sacrifice, and could be launched in salvos that overwhelmed defenses. When the pulse jet cut out, the bomb would nose over and plummet to Earth, detonating on impact. Londoners learned to fear the silence more than the sound. As long as you could hear the engine, you were safe. When it stopped, you had 15 seconds to find cover. The first V-1 struck London on June 13, 1944, just 1 week after D-Day. Within days, dozens were falling daily. Within weeks, hundreds. The psychological impact was immense. Unlike conventional bombing raids, there was no warning, no air raid sirens giving people time to reach shelters. The V-1s came day and night, indiscriminate and relentless. By the end of June, over 2,000 flying bombs had been launched at Britain. The death toll climbed. Entire streets vanished. Hospitals, schools, homes. The V-1 made no distinction. Britain's air defense system, so effective against manned bombers during the Blitz, struggled against this new threat. Anti-aircraft guns found the small, fast-moving targets incredibly difficult to hit. Barrage balloons helped, but V-1s often flew too high or too low. Fighter interception seemed the obvious solution, but here the British faced a critical problem. The V-1's top speed of 400 miles per hour exceeded the maximum speed of many frontline fighters, especially at low altitude where the bombs typically flew. The venerable Spitfire Mark V, backbone of fighter command, could barely catch them. The Hurricane, hero of the Battle of Britain, had no chance at all. Even newer aircraft like the Spitfire Mark IX struggled to close the distance before the bombs reached London. And when pilots did catch them, shooting them down presented its own dangers. Squadron leader Roland Beaumont, flying Hawker Tempests with No. 150 wing, discovered this the hard way. On June 16th, he successfully intercepted a V-1 and opened fire from behind. His cannon shells struck the bomb's fuel tank. The resulting explosion was so violent that Beaumont's aircraft was thrown sideways. the blast wave buckling his wing panels and cracking his canopy. He barely made it back to base. Other pilots weren't so fortunate. Flying Officer Ken Collier pursued a V-1 over Kent, firing until it exploded. Debris from the detonation struck his Spitfire's propeller and engine. He managed to crash land in a field, walking away with minor injuries but no aircraft. The mathematics were brutal. Get too close when firing and the explosion could destroy your own aircraft. Stay too far back and accuracy suffered. The V-1's small size and speed made it a difficult target even for experienced pilots. Cannon fire had to be precise. Hit the fuselage wrong, and the bomb might detonate immediately. Hit the wing, and it might simply wobble and continue toward its target. Fighter Command needed a new approach. It was Flight Lieutenant Ken Collier. Yes, the same pilot who had survived that earlier explosion, who first stumbled upon the technique that would change everything. On a patrol in late June, Collier pursued a V-1 but held his fire, wary of another close-range detonation. As he drew alongside the bomb, matching its speed, he noticed something extraordinary. His aircraft's presence affected the V-1's flight. The air pressure differential created by his wing disturbed the bomb's aerodynamics. When he edged closer, the V-1 began to bank. Collier later described the moment with characteristic British understatement. "I thought, well, that's interesting." He maneuvered his Spitfire's wingtip beneath the V-1's wing, barely 2 feet separating them. Both aircraft were traveling at nearly 400 miles per hour. The slightest misjudgment would mean collision and instant death. Collier held position, feeling the turbulence, watching the bomb's wing rise as his own wing's airflow disrupted its lift. Then, with a gentle but firm movement, he lifted his wing. The V-1 rolled. Its gyroscopic guidance system, designed for straight and level flight, couldn't compensate. The bomb flipped onto its back, nosed over, and plummeted into the English Channel, detonating harmlessly in the water. Collier had just invented aerial tipping. Word spread rapidly through Fighter Command. Other pilots began experimenting with the technique. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, already a veteran V-1 hunter, refined the method. The key, he discovered, was precise speed matching and nerves of absolute steel. The pilot had to approach from behind and slightly below, accelerating to match the V-1 speed exactly. Then came the delicate part, sliding the fighter's wingtip under the bomb's wing, close enough for the air pressure differential to take effect but not so close as to risk collision. The margin for error was measured in inches. At 400 miles per hour, inches disappeared in milliseconds. Beaumont described the sensation as flying formation with a partner who didn't know you were there and wouldn't care if contact meant mutual annihilation. The technique required perfect conditions. Smooth air was essential, turbulence made precise positioning impossible. Clear visibility was critical, and the pilot needed an aircraft capable of matching the V-1 speed, which limited the technique to Tempests, Spitfire Mark 14s, and the occasional Mustang. Most importantly, it required a particular kind of courage. Not the hot-blooded aggression of dogfighting, but cold, calculated bravery. The pilot had to suppress every survival instinct screaming at him to stay away from the flying bomb, and instead fly closer than reason allowed. One pilot, Flight Lieutenant Raymond Baxter, later recalled his first attempt at tipping. He approached a V-1 over the channel, hands sweating inside his gloves despite the cold at altitude. As he drew alongside, the bomb's pulse jet created a hammering vibration he could feel through his aircraft's frame. The warhead was clearly visible beneath the bomb's fuselage, close enough to read the stenciled markings. Baxter eased his Tempest's wingtip under the V-1's wing. 2 feet separated them, then 18 inches, then 12. The turbulence increased. His aircraft shuddered. The V-1's wing began to rise. Baxter held position, fighting the buffeting, and then lifted his wings sharply. The bomb rolled, inverted, and dove. Baxter pulled up hard, watching it fall away toward the sea. His hands were shaking. His shirt was soaked with sweat. He had just saved dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives, and he felt like vomiting. Not every attempt succeeded. The technique had a steep learning curve, and mistakes were unforgiving. Flying Officer David in C attempted to tip a V-1 over Surrey but misjudged the closure rate. His wingtip struck the bomb's wing. The impact was relatively minor, just a glancing blow, but at 400 miles per hour, minor impacts have major consequences. In C's wing buckled. The V-1 veered off course but remained airborne, crashing into a field rather than the town it had been aimed at. In C managed to land his damaged Tempest, but the aircraft was written off. He walked away, but the incident reinforced the technique's dangers. Then there was the problem of the bomb's gyroscopic guidance. The V-1 used a simple but effective autopilot system that kept it flying straight and level. When tipped, the gyroscope would sometimes correct the roll, bringing the bomb back to level flight. Pilots learned they had to flip the V-1 completely inverted, past 90 degrees, to overwhelm the guidance system. This required getting even closer, holding position even longer, and accepting even greater risk. Squadron leader Joseph Barry became one of the most successful practitioners of the tipping technique. Flying Tempests with No. 501 Squadron, Barry developed an almost supernatural ability to judge distances at high speed. His logbook recorded 17 V-1s destroyed by tipping alone, with another dozen by conventional gunfire. Fellow pilots described watching Barry work with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He would slide his Tempest alongside a V-1 with apparent ease, hold position, as if connected by invisible wires, then flick the bomb away like swatting a fly. After one particularly successful patrol where he tipped 3 V-1s in quick succession, Barry landed and was asked how he maintained such precision. His response: "You don't think about it. The moment you think, you hesitate." Hesitation at 400 miles per hour means failure. The psychological toll was immense. Unlike conventional combat where the enemy was another pilot, another human being making decisions and mistakes, the V-1 was implacable. It didn't flinch, didn't evade, didn't fear. It simply flew its programmed course toward London, indifferent to the pilot risking his life to stop it. And there was no glory in the traditional sense. No dogfight victories to claim, no enemy aircraft to paint on the fuselage. Just the knowledge that somewhere below, people who would never know your name would live because you had flown closer to death than any reasonable person would accept. The technique spread beyond the initial pioneers. By July 1944, dozens of pilots were attempting tips. Success rates varied wildly. Some pilots never managed it, their aircraft too slow or their nerve insufficient. Others became specialists, seeking out V-1s specifically to practice the technique. Wing Commander Beaumont organized informal training sessions, where experienced tippers would fly alongside novices, demonstrating the approach, the positioning, the critical moment of the flip. There were no official manuals, no training films, just experienced pilots passing knowledge to younger ones, teaching them how to dance with death at 400 miles per hour. The dangers extended beyond the obvious risk of collision. The V-1's pulse jet engine produced intense heat and vibration. Pilots who flew too close for too long reported instruments failing, canopy frames cracking, even control surfaces becoming temporarily unresponsive due to the turbulence. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Sames tipped a V-1 successfully, but found his Spitfire's engine cutting out moments later. Investigation revealed that flying in the bomb's exhaust wake for 30 seconds had fouled his spark plugs. He glided to an emergency landing, aircraft intact but useless until the engine was overhauled. Then there was the question of what happened when things went wrong. Flight Lieutenant James McCairns attempted to tip a V-1 over Sussex. As he positioned his Tempest, the bomb's engine suddenly cut out, a not uncommon occurrence with the temperamental pulse jets. The V-1 immediately nosed over into its terminal dive. McCairns, flying inches away, had perhaps 2 seconds to react. He slammed his stick sideways, rolling away from the diving bomb. His wingtip missed the V-1's tail by less than a foot. The bomb struck a hillside and exploded. The blast wave caught McCairns' aircraft, flipping it inverted. He fought for control, finally righting the Tempest at less than 500 feet. He landed, shut down the engine, and sat in the cockpit for 10 minutes, unable to stop his hands shaking. He flew again the next day. Statistics from July and August 1944 tell the story. Of the thousands of V-1s launched at Britain, Fighter Command destroyed over 1,000. Of those, approximately 100 were destroyed by tipping. The numbers seem small, but each successful tip represented not just one bomb destroyed, but one pilot who had survived an encounter that defied rational risk assessment. And the psychological impact on German planners was significant. The V-1 was supposed to be unstoppable, a weapon against which there was no defense. The fact that British pilots were physically pushing them out of the sky using nothing but skill and courage undermined the weapon's terror value. The technique evolved throughout the summer. Pilots discovered that tipping worked best at specific altitudes, too low, and there wasn't enough time to recover if something went wrong, too high, and the thinner air made the pressure differential less effective. They learned that approaching from the side was safer than from directly below, giving a better view and more escape options. They discovered that some V-1 variants were more stable than others, requiring more aggressive tipping to overwhelm their guidance systems. Wing Commander Beaumont pioneered a variation where instead of lifting his wing to flip the bomb, he would lower it sharply after positioning above the V-1. The sudden removal of his wing's downwash would cause the bomb's wing to rise abruptly, achieving the same result with slightly less risk of collision. Other pilots experimented with using their aircraft's slipstream rather than direct wing-to-wing proximity, flying slightly ahead of the V-1 and using propeller wash to destabilize it. Results were mixed, but the experimentation demonstrated the innovative thinking Fighter Command encouraged. Not all heroes of the V-1 campaign flew fighters. Ground crews worked around the clock to keep aircraft serviceable. The Tempest's Napier Sabre engine was notoriously temperamental, requiring constant maintenance. Mechanics often worked through the night, knowing that every hour an aircraft sat idle was another hour V-1s flew unopposed. Radar operators tracked incoming bombs, vectoring fighters to intercept. Their calm voices over the radio guided pilots through clouds and darkness toward targets they couldn't see. Anti-aircraft gunners, initially frustrated by the V-1's speed and size, developed new techniques and technologies. By August, gun crews were destroying more V-1s than fighters, but the pilot's contribution remained critical for bombs that slipped through the coastal gun belt. The civilian population, enduring the bombardment with characteristic British resilience, drew strength from knowing that young men were risking everything to protect them. Stories of pilots tipping V-1 spread through pubs and newspapers, becoming part of the mythology of British determination. By September 1944, the tide had turned. Allied ground forces overran the V-1 launch sites in France and Belgium. The bombardment decreased dramatically. The final V-1 fell on Britain on March 29, 1945. In total, over 9,000 had been launched. Nearly 2,000 reached London. 6,000 died. 17,000 were injured. But without the efforts of fighter command, the toll would have been far higher. The pilots who mastered the tipping technique had saved countless lives. They had taken an impossible challenge and invented an improbable solution. They had flown closer to death than most people can imagine, not once but dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. They did it not for glory or recognition, but because people needed protecting and they had the skill and courage to do what needed doing. Flight Lieutenant Joseph Barry survived the war. He rarely spoke about his V-1 victories, considering them simply part of the job. When asked years later about the tipping technique, he said, "We did what had to be done. The bombs were coming. We had to stop them. The method didn't matter. The result did." That pragmatic courage, that understated heroism, defined Britain's response to the V-1 threat. When Hitler's vengeance weapon brought terror from the skies, young pilots responded not with despair but with innovation. They took outdated tactics, invented new ones, and proved that human skill and determination could overcome technological terror. The V-1 campaign demonstrated that even in modern warfare, even against pilotless weapons and automated death, the human element remained decisive. The bombs were fast, numerous, and terrifying, but they were also predictable, mechanical, and ultimately vulnerable to pilots willing to risk everything. Those pilots, flying wingtip-to-wingtip with oblivion, wrote a chapter of aerial warfare that remains unmatched for sheer audacity. They proved that when the stakes are highest, when conventional methods fail, human ingenuity and raw courage can still tip the balance, literally.